Hello, everyone. Welcome to the LinkedIn Speaker Series. Thanks to all of you for being here in the room in San Francisco, and thanks to everyone for tuning in live over the stream. I'm Laura Davenport, and I'm on the internal communications team here at LinkedIn. For those who are new, the Speaker Series is a monthly program that we do every month to bring in inspirational speakers from all different walks of life to share their stories, how they got to where they are today, and any insights and learnings they've learned along the way. You can catch all of our speaker series on the internet at speakers.linkedin.com, and we also have a podcast series on iTunes. So without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce our two speakers today. Joanna Coles is the Chief Content Officer at Hearst Magazine, where she oversees the editorial content and partnerships for over 300 magazines worldwide. She was recently named by the New York Times as one of the most powerful women in media. And she is here today to talk with us about her career and the journey that she's been on. To introduce her, we've got our very own Shannon Brayton, who is a professional communicator herself. Last year, she was recognized by Forbes as one of the most influential CMOs in the world. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome both Shannon and Joanna to the stage.
Thank you, everyone, for being here, and big thank you to Joanna for traveling all the way from New York to be with us. We are thrilled to have you.
Thank you, and I shall be drinking prominently out of my LinkedIn Women's
Woo!
bottle. Yeah, very
Thank you for that.
Yeah, it was worth it just for that.
And hello to everyone joining us from the stream. It is great to not be able to see any of you, unfortunately, but I know you're there, and it's wonderful to see all of you in San Francisco. So we have a little bit of a tradition here, which is to drop your top of your LinkedIn bottle.
Thank you.
It is to tell us something that we would not know about you by looking at your current LinkedIn profile, which I recently peeked at and looks amazing.
Good, thank you. I'm very excited to be an influencer on LinkedIn. Well, probably, I don't think it's on my resume, though it's actually the first thing I ever did, which was, as a child, I created my own magazine with a friend, and we sent it to the Queen of England. And we were 11 at the time, and the amazing thing was, this was 2 months later, we got a letter back from a lady in waiting to Her Majesty, saying the Queen had very much enjoyed reading the issue, and she was looking forward to further copies, which was all the encouragement I needed.
Do you still have that letter?
Yeah, of course I do. Are you kidding me? My mum kept that letter, and actually when I was back home in England not long ago, I brought it back with me because I was like, I'm never letting this out of my sight.
What was that magazine about?
Oh, it was all sorts of random jottings and terrible drawings that I did because I'm not very good at art, but it was just my expressions. And then I sort of created junk mail because I would get my dad to photocopy it, and then I would go around and stuff it in all the neighbours' mailboxes, and they weren't as appreciative as the Queen.
So you were born to be a chief content officer.
I think so, was.
Right?
Yeah, I think so.
So Hearst has literally 300 titles?
It has 300 magazines across the world, yeah.
And so when you think about creating a new magazine, what's sort of your creative process? How do you come up with the idea and think about what kind of content's going to be part of that? Who's going to run it? What does it look like? I'd love to know a little peek into your creative mind.
Well, I think we're always looking for partners to do things with. And our most recent, we've got 2 magazines that we launched last year. Pioneer Woman, which is a magazine with Ree Drummond, who's the most extraordinary character who lives in an enormous farm in Oklahoma. And it literally, from New York, takes 5.5 days to get there with as many planes as you can muster. Not quite, but almost. And she has a sort of very laid-back, interesting lifestyle on the plains. And so that's been hugely successful. And then almost the opposite of that is Airbnb Magazine, which I don't know if any of you've seen, but has taken off in the travel community.
Has anyone seen that?
It's such a fun process, and the co-founders of Airbnb have been super involved in it. So what we're trying to do is create travel content that isn't trying to sell to you the classic holiday or tourism. It's trying to create this sense of travel as a lifestyle and a way of getting to understand and know people.
And what calculus did you go through thinking about how do you pair a tech brand and a media brand?
Well, I think when you're purely a tech brand, there is this moment in your development when you crave a physical manifestation of that brand. And if you're Airbnb, one of the things that's brilliant about it is it's so easy to book something, but it's an inconsistent experience. Is there anybody here who hasn't stayed in an Airbnb? Oh, okay, so that's how interesting. Only 2, 3, 4, 4
Is there anyone who
people
does
out
not
of
plan
4
to?
rooms.
That's also me. I know.
They're kind of fun. You should try it. You really should try it once or twice.
Sorry. Oh, you guys know my story. Many of you know my
so
story about me
difficult.
passing
She's so difficult.
on investing in the company. I thought it was a terrible idea. So as you can see,
Right.
definitely a person to tap about what's
Okay, so
hot.
you're in denial that they even exist.
At some point, I'll come around, I promise.
All right. Well, to loop back to your point, why would a tech company want to do a magazine? Because if you're checking into an Airbnb property, there's no consistency across the properties that they rent at all. But if you have something that represents the brand, it sort of says this is what the brand values are. And so the idea is it's on every nightstand, it's on every table when you check into a property so that you can feel connected and that you know that there is something that Airbnb stands for, and it's inclusive and it's at home in the world and it's living like a local.
And it's really taken off, the magazine.
Yeah,
People love it.
super successful. People love it, yeah.
In my prep for our chat, even though we've known each other a little bit now, I still did some prep on this. I read a quote that said that you really love to be underestimated.
Well, it's a very useful thing in the business world.
And are you proving people wrong, Miss Most Powerful Woman?
Well,
in
look,
media?
the great news is if they underestimate you and you fail, they weren't expecting anything, right? But if they underestimate you and then you succeed or you surprise, then you're ahead of the game.
And so going back to your creative process a little bit too on the magazine, when you decide this is something worth investing in and worth catering to an audience, what kind of research and what sort of thought process do you guys have inside of Hearst to come up with who that is?
Well, we have great teams of editors, but what we're really looking for is people who are curious, people who aren't only relying on data, and people who can see patterns before other people see patterns and notice things. And if you're a good journalist, and we have a lot of them at Hearst, what you're doing is just, and I think of myself as a whale sucking up plankton, right? So I'm just one of those
visual.
things just drifting along, and I've got one of those kind of huge weird grill things that whales have, and stuff is just floating in, and every now and then you feel you can feel trends and you sort of spot them ahead of time. And if you're editing a good magazine, your goal is to be predicting what's going to happen in 3 to 6 to 9 months ahead. It's not like being a news site or a regular content platform where you're reacting to what's going on in the moment. And so you want to disassociate from that and think about, well, where are people going now? What are they going to be thinking about? And that's the fun of it.
So after you've swallowed up some of this plankton and the editor is in charge of this magazine, what makes for a really great editor? Knowing that the New York Times literally has called you one of the most powerful people in media,
Yeah, I don't
you
know what
must
they
have
meant by that.
You must have an eye for spotting those types of people. So what really makes a great editor these days, especially?
Well, I think a great editor is someone who never takes no for an answer, and who understand. A great editor is like a great chef. You're trying to put all the ingredients together, and each ingredient should enhance the others. And you don't want to overwhelm it with one flavor. And you want to have a little bit that will appeal to the audience, that will appeal to everybody in the audience. If you think of HBO only needs to do one show per group of people. So they need one millennial show, one boomer show, one sports show, one show about fashion, one show about whatever. They just need to service one show, but it's got to be the best show, right? There's got to be a reason why, if you're a boomer, you want to watch Divorce as opposed to The Girlfriend's Guide for Divorce, which is another interesting show about divorce, but it's not as good as the Sarah Jessica Parker show. So you have to have the best stuff. So we need people who have very high standards, who won't say no, because good people will always say no first, right? So if you want interviews with people, if you want access with people, they will always say no because they don't have time, so you've got to persuade them. And then you want someone who understands the mix of it all and understands that at the end of a magazine, you want to sort of throw it across the room and seize a new life. It should expose you to things, and it should be a journey of discovery that you didn't know you wanted to go on.
It's a pretty high bar.
It's quite a high bar, but it's such fun.
Will you tell us a little bit about your career path, how you got to where you are? I know it's been a few years, so I would love if you would just give the audience a little bit of a summary about how you arrived to your current spot.
Sure. I mean, my background is as a journalist, and I worked for the Daily Telegraph, which at the time was the biggest newspaper in the world, and I got fast-tracked onto the night news desk, which was literally the most miserable experience of my working life, and yet one of the most useful. And I used to roll up at work at 6 o'clock in the evening on this horrific place called the Isle of Dogs, which if you ever go to London, there's no need to go there. And at the time, it was being developed as a business park, and it was kind of terrifying to walk across the car park. And I would leave at 3 in the morning, completely hyper, with no one to hang out with. And my companion at the time, the guy that I worked alongside, and this is a true story, was a total alcoholic. So much of an alcoholic that he drove a London cab on the grounds that he would never get stopped for drunk driving because because a London cab license takes 3 years to earn, and you have to learn every single street in London, and then you're tested on it. That's how you get your cabbie medal. Of course, you don't need it now because it's GPS. But back then, so he drove this cab on the grounds that he could roar all over the streets and no one would ever pick him up, and they never did, amazingly. He would come to work, he would go under the desk, and he would curl up in a ball and go to sleep. And then at about midnight, when the last lot of sub-editors came in, he would go around the office with a coolie bag full of sausages that he'd made, homemade sausages. And he was an obsessive about ancient sausage recipes. And he had medieval recipes, Elizabethan recipes, and they were fantastic.
When did he have time to make those if he was drinking all the time?
Well, because during the day.
Oh, during the day.
Right. So
got it.
You wouldn't go to sleep till like 6 o'clock, but then you'd wake up at midday, and then there was nothing to do all afternoon.
Make sausage.
Yeah, he made sausages. I would go swimming. It was a very odd lifestyle. But I did it for nine months, and then it sort of fast-tracked me. And then I joined The Guardian, and they posted me to New York as a foreign correspondent, bureau chief, 20 years ago, which is why I ended up moving here. And then I rapidly had 2 children, which meant that I could no longer be a foreign correspondent and rush off at the drop of a story, which was really what the job was and what I had always loved and always thought I wanted to do. And it was a bit of a shock, actually, having a second child and thinking, whoa, I'm not going to be able to do this.
Right.
And it wasn't the job's fault. My life no longer fitted with the job, right. And I wanted to see my children. I didn't want to be on the road the whole time. So I went into magazines on the premise that I would be able to control my schedule, which is sort of true. And the one thing that I think is really important for women to know, and the men too, but I think the men instinctively know this more, and there's less drama around it for the men. But this was the bit I hadn't understood, that the minute you become in charge of something, it's so much more fun, you get tons more money, you get loads more support, and your life actually becomes easier. And that's the bit that women in particular are not taught. They're taught that, oh my God, you're going to have kids, you've got to juggle, your life's going to change, it's all a disaster. And you just think, well, why would anybody do this? And indeed, far fewer people are having children than they used to. But actually, the secret is, the higher up a corporate ladder you go, the easier it is because you're in control of your schedule. And the Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, who's from New York, has 2 young children and talks endlessly about how people say to her, how could you be a senator and have children? She's like, oh my God, I control my schedule. I pick them up from school. If I want to go back to work at 7 o'clock, I can do, but at 4:30, I pick them up.
The control is really
2 hours.
The important part.
It's all about control. Yeah. And you have control because you have your own office out of the main office.
I do.
That's not a corporate secret.
I don't totally agree that it gets a lot easier, but keep telling us more about your career.
Well, the problems, the problems might get more difficult. But you also then have more experience figuring it out.
Yeah, and you do realize that you do have control and you don't need to be told what to do all the time. That part I agree with.
Well, and also that you don't always have to show up for a boss, and you just have much more. I think you have more confidence, and you definitely have a bit more control, and you learn that you can say no, and that the world isn't going to stop if you say no.
Good point.
Apart from today, if you'd said no, the world would have stopped.
That would have been bad.
Crushed. Yeah.
Okay, so follow me, and then you got into magazines.
So I got into magazines. I worked for New York Magazine initially. Then I became the editor of Marie Claire, which I did for 6 years, and which I loved because I had an American boss and I had a French boss. And I have one amusing interview story about it, which is I go for the interview for the editor of Marie Claire, and I've been away on holiday, and our messages have missed each other, and I arrive at the office having had a blow dry and bought a new suit and had a manicure, and actually those 3 things, like the triple whammy, was unusual for me. And I got there and they said, oh, I'm sorry, did you not get our message? The woman that I was meeting, Kathy Black, she's going to France, you've missed her. And I knew, I was like, fuck it, I've got a new suit, I've got a blowout, I've got a manicure, this is never happening again, I have to capitalize on this. So I said, well, has she left for the airport yet? And they said, she's leaving from her home in about 5 minutes. And I said, it came out of my mouth, I said, well, can I ride to the airport with her in the car? And they said, well, if you can get to her house, you can. So I came screaming out of the building. I stopped a cab in the middle of 6th Avenue. I pulled the passenger out, tossed him to the curb. I was like, I'll pick up your fare, my good man. And we drag raced up Park Avenue because Kathy's car had come out and I could see this
Did she know you were coming?
Black limo. Yes, they
Okay.
called her ahead of time.
Okay.
But she was like, well, I'm going to the airport. If she gets here, fine, but I don't care otherwise. And I saw her sleek black limo pull out and I was like to the driver, follow that car. And then she saw, and we literally drag raced up Park Avenue until she pulled over and I leapt into the car. And by the time she got to JFK, I knew I had the job.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was a kind of
That
fun
actually
story.
deserves.
Well,
What does Kathy think about that story now, in hindsight?
I think she loves that story because also it
It's
shows
an
that
excellent story.
she's flexible too.
Yeah, and not scared of a potential stalker in a taxi.
Right, that's true. But also, if you're an executive, you're always trying to use that time you have in cars really efficiently. I'm always on the phone or, you're on your email.
So career inflection points for you, is that one of them?
Well, that would definitely be one of them. Then I think that when they asked me to go and edit Cosmo, my initial reaction was sort of, I could think of 5 other people that would do that better than me. Which is, I think, again, often women's reaction other than men's reaction. And this is not to slam men. I think that, anyway, my reaction was, I can think of what about this person, and this person. And they were like, no, we want you. And I was like, oh, all right. And I didn't fully understand quite how big Cosmo was until I got the job. And then I realized I had the most extraordinary platform and I really wanted to use it. And what I think we did was use it for what I called feminism by stealth. Which was you didn't want to bang people over the head with sort of women's empowerment, but it was clearly it was just all bubbling under this sense of new empowerment and a feminist reawakening, and this was sort of 5-6 years ago, and we just were ahead of the curve on it, and it was really exciting. And also, what's really, really exciting is when you're doing something and it gets momentum and it works, and we just had a lot of luck. We did the first excerpt of Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, and that was
5 years ago.
Exactly 5 years ago. And that she became our careers editor, and it was at exactly the right point for us and for her.
So that's a great, when we talked about trend spotting, that you have to be a great editor to do that, that sounds like something you were definitely ahead of. What sort of personal inflection points did you have at Cosmo? From a career standpoint?
Well, I think realizing that I had a platform and that I really had to take this seriously, because Marie Claire, it's a wonderful magazine, but it's much smaller, and it doesn't have, because it's half French, it doesn't quite have the same place in America's heart that Cosmo did. And when I was thinking about Helen Gurley Brown, who was the really dominant editor of the 20th century and an extraordinary character and an amazing woman. I mean, she made so much money from reinventing Cosmo and understanding when she started, 1965, that the FDA's approval of the contraceptive pill would change the way we were living, and it really did. I mean, it was astonishing. Suddenly people could have sex without worrying about having kids. Not that they'd ever been doing that before, of course, but it was a different moment for women. And I was trying to figure out what was that moment now, and it really was this sort of sense of reawakening. And I had read Cheryl's book really early on. I'd read a very early draft, and it was clear to me that was going to become a big thing. And it was really fun to be part of it and to start talking to women about how to negotiate. And here's the fascinating thing, as editor of Cosmo, we got 2 questions all the time, and they were by far...
From readers?
Yeah, from readers.
Readers.
The most common questions: how do I negotiate a raise, and how do I have an orgasm? And it was
Remember,
sort of...
this is a professional audience at a professional network.
Well, professional audiences have orgasms too, just not at work. At least for your sake, I hope you do. But I thought...
Just not in this building.
Yeah, definitely not in this building. Oh God, we might be sexually harassing the audience at this point. Please don't report us.
Is there a
to
lawyer
HR.
in the house?
Yeah.
I guarantee there is, but... Oh, I saw a hand now.
Well, I think
Okay.
we need a lawyer in the room. I want
good.
a lawyer when I'm talking to you. And this just struck me as sort of fascinating that these were the two questions. And so I sort of set out in my kind of earnest little way to try and help people answer them.
Both of them.
Both of them.
Equally?
Equally.
Okay, fair enough. And so on the Helen Gurley Brown inspiration piece, who currently inspires you? When you look outside your beautiful office, who are the people in New York that inspire you? Who inspires you outside of New York? I'd be very curious.
Well, I think, you couldn't fail to be inspired by the kids at that Florida school, right? I mean, I'm inspired by young people that get up and do things, by young people who are much braver than I was at their age, and who've got something to say and are fresh-faced about it and excited and inclusive. And I'm inspired by people like that. I'm less inspired by super powerful people because I come across a lot of them, and that, which is not to say they're not incredibly interesting. Of course they are. But if you ask who inspires me,
right.
It's people who have got a lot to lose who do things.
Yeah, who aren't born powerful either, right?
Right, absolutely.
They're actually building it up from the ground up. I was going to ask you a question about your treadmill desk.
Yes.
So we're just all over the map here on topics, but a lot of your Instagram pictures and stories have you on your treadmill desk. Can you please enlighten this audience about your treadmill desk addiction?
Yes, hashtag real corporate life. The treadmill desk is such a metaphor, I think, for
this is why I like it.
So many things,
Yeah.
right? I mean, the reason I got one, and this is going to sound name droppery, but I was in Stacey Snider's office at DreamWorks, and she was Steven Spielberg's producing partner for 20 years, and she was someone that I found pretty inspiring, actually. And she'd sort of survived Hollywood, and she's in fantastic shape. And there she was, sort of plowing away on her desk. So I immediately ordered exactly the same as hers. And then, rather thrillingly, because I'd started posting about it, I ran into the company at CES, the Consumer Electronics Show, the company that makes them. And they recognized me because I'd been posting about it, and they called me over, and I got chatting to them, and then I decided I would give them some feedback, because one of the things I love to do is give unsolicited feedback. And I said, the problem is it's got this sort of rather nasty grey Formica top, and what I want is a wooden top, and I'd really like a cup holder. And so, to my amazement, they produced one for me. And the other thing I wanted, because I leap on and off, and I often have to wear heels because I'm also in fashion, they got one that goes up and down at the press of a button. And of course, they made this for me. I immediately started posting it, and then they got inundated with people wanting one, and it's now one of their top selling. Yeah,
treadmill.
It's now one of their top selling.
And how many steps do you get in a day?
Well, if I had an odometer in it, which is my next desk that I want.
Yeah, that seems like a no-brainer.
I would have walked to China and back. It's a very, very useful way of just getting in a bit of exercise when you have a lot to do. And I have my computer on it, which is the key. And I just walk at a very slow pace, sort of between 1.2 and 1.8. And you just clock up the miles. And you can walk.
It looks like you're going a lot faster when you do the boomerang
the
version.
hyperlapse.
The
Yes,
it looks like you're going much faster than 1.2 to 1.8.
I'm really not.
So let me ask you, not a hard question, but maybe it's slightly rhetorical as well. Does the world still need magazines?
Yes, I think people more than ever need magazines. And
tell us why.
Well, I think what's fascinating is that we're at an inflection point in our understanding of our use with digital, right? And we're in what I think of as a sort of post-euphoric digital moment, where we're beginning to understand the downside as well as the tremendous freedoms that our phones give us. And you all know, and you don't need behavioral scientists to tell you this, if you sit with your phone for an hour and a half, at the end of it, you've scrolled through a ton of stuff, maybe you're better informed, you feel like you might know what's going on, but actually, physically and mentally, I bet that you actually feel a bit listless and kind of slightly agitated and like, oh, fuck, where did that hour and a half go? And who can tell me, someone here may know this, how tall the Statue of Liberty is? Does anybody know? All right, it's 304 feet tall, which is exactly the same amount as the average amount of content on Facebook that people scroll through a day. So you know from that there is a lot of crap that you're just sort of thumbing through.
Yeah, it becomes mindless at some point.
Yeah, it becomes mindless, and you're doing it because you don't want to be on your own. You don't want to be left with your own thoughts. I think we've abandoned the idea that solitude is good for us. And I think that when you put your phone down, if you can get through the initial panic of feeling disconnected, and you can sit there for a little bit on your own. A magazine is a different kind of experience. It's a different kind of journey. If it's a good one, it will transport you. There's an extraordinary story in Vanity Fair this month about the last 48 hours of the ship El Faro that is actually the biggest maritime disaster for the last 30 years. It's a fascinating story. They got hold of the tapes of the conversations with the captain and all the first mates and stuff. And I just read it absolutely breathless. You can't have that experience online. You can have other experiences online, but you can't read stories, and people need stories to connect. And you don't want a story that you're really engaged in with little notifications shooting across it, because it stops you being able to concentrate. And I think what the Centre for Humane Technology is doing is really very interesting with Tristan Harris up there. I know he's a sort of polarising figure in the Valley, but if you're a parent, I defy you to be a parent and have not asked your kids to get off their phones. I defy you to find a married couple where one of them hasn't said, for fuck's sake, put your phone down. And I defy you to find a boss who hasn't said to one of their staff, I can't believe you emailed him or texted him that. He's in the next cubicle. Go and talk to him.
Right. The other downside of that part, too, is the fact that I don't know about this maritime disaster, but I know what someone I went to high school with had for breakfast who I haven't thought about or talked to in 10 years, right? I mean, that is the bizarre isolation where I feel like I'm up to speed on a bunch of things that don't matter, but I have no sense of a whole bunch of things that I really should know more about.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And also, I think this idea of it connects you with people, but it doesn't help you get to know people better.
At all, right? I'd love to know a little bit about what it's been like to be on the Snap board of directors. Is it 2 years you've been there now?
Yeah, nearly 3 actually, or 2.5. I mean, enormous fun, and fascinating.
What have you taken out of it that you've applied to your day-to-day?
Well, really thinking about the new ways that people communicate, and that it's a different language, and that, it's primarily a camera, and that you immediately go straight through the lens into a new world. It's a different kind of aperture and view on the world. And you can see it's creating a new language in terms of communication, visual communication, video communication. Incredibly interesting to be involved in a company that's staffing up that fast, because I think when I first met the co-founders, there were 30 people on the staff, and there's now almost 3,000.
How did you get introduced to Evan?
I met him through his then COO, actually, who I met him through his COO. I then went to meet him in New York to talk about content, because they were thinking about creating what turned into the Discover page. And we had so many mind melds on it, and he reads a ton. I mean, he inhales books, he reads a lot of long-form journalism, and so we sort of bonded over that. And then we just became friends and had a lot of conversations, long, sort of really intriguing conversations about where content goes.
So where does content go?
Very good question. It sort of goes everywhere. The key is who's reading it and is it any good? And here was Evan's point, which was really, he said this to me 4 years ago, and he's an extremely prescient founder, which was, look, the web is full of crap and it's going to get worse, and we don't want that on Snap. We want to create a curated platform with human editors, because we don't want it only being served up by algorithms, and we want trusted media brands. That's how we want to deliver our news. And it's become, the de facto news platform now for millennials. And he really understood what fake news was long before we ever heard the term. Yeah, and he was determined not to have it on. That's not what he wanted to subscribe to. And so you have the Discover platform, which is unbelievably successful and has, millions of people looking at it every day. And we have 7 Hearst brands on it. And it's really extended those brands like Esquire and Cosmo and Harper's Bazaar to a whole new generation of readers.
So speaking of good content, if you're in San Francisco, you have a copy of Love Rules, Joanna's new book. When did it come out?
It came out last Tuesday.
Last Tuesday. It's already on Amazon.com's bestseller list, which is awesome to see. Why did you write this book?
Well, I wrote the book because I have talked to hundreds of women over the last few years, and what I realized was they were feeling really and again, this is no reflection on the guys in the room, because guys feel like this, I think, too, but there was tremendous dissatisfaction with their relationships. a struggle to communicate what they wanted. And of course, dating apps, while they are absolutely brilliant and allow you to extend your social network in a really positive way, can also, the flip side is they can also leave you feeling very, it can feel very transactional, and it can make you feel like if you're not up for something, someone else will be, and that's kind
FOMO.
of miserable. Right, there's a sense of FOMO, and there's a sense in which people can't commit because there might be something better going on. And so it's leading to different tropes of behavior in the dating world, and it's really for anyone, a millennial looking for love, and also for people who are either widowed or divorced or getting back out there, and the landscape has completely changed. And I had a full-time researcher working on it, and one of the most interesting things that we learned was from Mary Aitken, who's one of the best cyber psychologists, fascinating research that she's doing, talking about what happens when you communicate in a computer-mediated environment. And one of the things that happens, in particular once you get a match, is that you begin this sort of potentially exciting flirtatious text exchange. And I'm sure there's absolutely nobody in this room that's done that. But if there is anybody, you'll know what I'm talking about.
We won't ask you to raise your hands at this point.
Yeah, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands on this. But what's fascinating is you think it's one thing, but it's actually another. And what happens is when you're having this kind of conversation, you're filling in the blanks and attributing positive attributes to them, which in fact may not be there. And then if you eventually get it offline and sit down, you both sit down with potentially completely different expectations. And there is this sense in which you've somehow fast-forwarded the relationship and the difficult bits of a relationship. And getting to know people is always awkward, even if you think you're meant for each other from the get-go, which most people don't. And it can lead to all sorts of dramas. And the British police, interestingly, who have different crime stats on this because it's a smaller country and it's easier for them to pull them together nationally, discovered that actually if you go home with someone that you've met online, you take it offline, you meet, and you go home with them either to your place or to their place on your first date, you are 6 times more likely to be assaulted by them than you are if you meet them in a bar or by happenstance in a restaurant or through a friend. And they say there's a whole new level of sexual predator that they really didn't know about who's on these apps. And of course, they are absolutely brilliant things. If you look through the New York Times weddings announcement, at least a quarter of them, if not half of them now, people met on Tinder or Bumble or Happen or Hinge or any of them. But you need to be really sensible about how you use them. And also, you really want to get the relationship offline as fast as you can, because the hours that people spend in these crazy, sexting and texting exchanges with people that they
Create
think
like a
they
fantasy
know.
almost.
Yeah, and you create this fantasy character and it's exciting and you get the shot of dopamine, but it means nothing. It means absolutely nothing. And the number of people, both men and women, I sat with and interviewed who said that they had met people having had a long, prolonged, maybe 1,000, 2,000 exchanges of texts, and then they would meet the person and the person would say, oh, hey, that was really fun, I'm sorry, this isn't going to work, I don't want to waste your time, I'm going to go, I don't need a drink. And the crushed expectation and the disappointment of that is so difficult to get back up from.
Yeah, and the resilience. How do you get the resilience to go back online when that happens and you drive yourself potentially to more further isolation, I imagine?
Right. And the way they're marketed too, some of them, is this idea that somehow you're going to find the one on it. And the likelihood of you finding the one with a swipe is almost zero. And it's not actually how people meet each other. And again, it's this sense of, particularly with millennials, we have a generation that is challenged by eye-to-eye and contact. They don't like talking on the phone. They'd rather stick needles in their eyes than talk to someone on the phone. Why? Because it's difficult. Talking on the phone is difficult. You can't hear people. You misconstrue what they say. You talk over each other. Someone's banging around in the background. It's difficult, right? It's much easier to text. So we've served up a really interesting way of communicating that's so much easier. But you can't fast forward relationships. You can't microwave love. And so that's
Great
what
quote.
the book is trying to counsel against.
I heard you on a podcast with the Skim co-founders
Yep.
talking a little bit about a conversation you had with a friend's daughter.
Yes.
That made you realize this was a topic that was really, really important to explore?
So I think, and this goes to the heart of people finding it difficult to communicate, and it's also to do with the fact that there's so much porn available now, digital porn, especially on your cell phone. And women, I think, a lot of young women told me they felt they were competing with porn, and that if they didn't put out at the end of a date, the guy would just go home and switch on to Pornhub, or the girl would too. I mean, you know, I'm not saying it's exclusively used by men, though it's predominantly used by men. And so how I actually started the book was I was talking to a friend's daughter. She's 20, we were at a family dinner, and I was just making conversation. I'd known her since she was 6. Well-educated, intelligent, attractive girl at a very good liberal arts college on the northeast. And I said, so what do you do Friday night, Saturday nights at college, because she was home for the weekend? And she said that they pre-gamed, which I get, you know, she wasn't yet 21.
Here's where we're going to do a show of hands. Who pre-games? Just kidding.
Well, no one here needs to pre-game, but
anonymity.
You know, I get that they pre-game because they can't officially buy alcohol and that it's expensive, right? So the idea is you drink cheap liquor. But then she said, we go out, we get blackout drunk, we hook up with strangers, and then the next morning we all go down to the wellness centre and get Plan B together. And that felt to me like so depressing. And, you know, I'm not saying I was a saint during my college days, but that put me to shame. And I just thought, God, this kind of sucks. So I then started talking to more and more people and realized this was actually not that unusual. I then learned that 1 in 5 young women are on antidepressants, that 1 in 5 on college campuses say that they've been sexually assaulted, that 50% of those assaults take place with alcohol. And you have this really unhealthy place where relationships are being born. And I talked to a lot of academics for the books too, and several college presidents, and one of them said that she had talked extensively to students because she was worried about the binge drinking on campuses. And she would say, why do you do this? And they would say, and this was absolutely borne out by the people I talked to, look, it's a nightmare getting naked with a stranger on a Friday night. Of course we drink, we don't want to remember it. And you think, well, why are you having sex with people if you don't want to remember it? How is that empowering? And how is it fun to wake up on Saturday morning or to slope off on Friday night, not fully conscious of what you've done? And so I thought it was, I thought I need to write about this. I'm curious about it. I want to know more. I want to know why we're in this situation. But also I want to provide some guidelines for people so they don't end up feeling like this.
So, and the hypothesis about all of this behavior and these stats tied to the online component is just that people are much more comfortable transacting online, and then when they actually, because they're more comfortable, used to it, that's how they roll. When they actually go to the in-person part, they don't know how to cope with it, so they drink excessively.
Yeah, I think we've got out of practice with relationships, and I think there is
face to face.
Yes, and I think that there is a sense in which the whole culture is speeded up, and everything has to speed up, and everything's got to be urgent. And if you meet someone that night, you have to sleep with them. And listen, if you want to sleep with them, that's absolutely fine. I have absolutely no judgment about it. But what I was hearing was that people didn't actually want to fast forward that relationship as fast as they had been doing, and they certainly didn't want to do it on a serial basis, and that actually it was disappointing to get your expectations up and sleep with someone and then not hear from them the next night. And it was disappointing to feel interchangeable on a dating app, and that if you weren't prepared to swipe, then someone else would. And so I was going off what people were telling me. It wasn't what I wanted to impose on it. If you want to hook up with people, hook up with people. It's very easy to do. But from what I could see out there, it wasn't giving people the pleasure that I think they anticipated, and that's what I was interested in.
Have your sons read the book?
No, of course not. They're not remotely interested in reading
anything you have to say.
I've done. They definitely don't want to talk to their parents about sex. And I think that's fine. I didn't want to talk to my parents about sex. If you're a parent and you want to talk to your children, you could do worse than give them the book, because it's a very good way into it. And it's very straightforward. I'm unabashedly using terms that they use. But also my goal is this should be fun for you. Falling in love, having big passions is the stuff that makes life exciting. It's what makes us all feel alive. It's much more fun than almost anything else. And I didn't hear anybody, none of the young women I talked to, talked about falling in love. None of them talked about love.
It was more about what? Validation?
No, it was about sex. It was very much about sex. It was about hooking up. It was about being independent. There was a lot of anxiety for the young professional women I talked to in admitting that they wanted to have children. There was a lot of embarrassment about saying, well, I think I might want to get married. Because I think there's a feeling, especially sort of in post Time's Up and Me Too, that women have got to be sort of independent and capable of doing everything. And that if you admit that you want to find someone to share it with, then that suggests you're not.
So interesting.
Yeah, you're not fully independent. And so I think there's a conflict there that women are trying to resolve. And I think guys are too. Yeah.
So you've been out on the book tour since last Tuesday, I think,
Yeah.
right? So just almost a week. What questions have you gotten that really, really surprised you?
Oh, that's a very good question. Well, I've had all sorts of questions from people. I guess people are sort of anxious about where it goes from here. A lot of people have talked about how do you meet people. A lot of people have talked about how much time they spend online and curating an online audience, and what is the point of that? And it's a really good question. And I think there was a moment when we all thought we had to have as many followers as we could possibly get. And then you realize that what is the value of a Facebook friend? Actually, what is the value of one if you're not trying to sell something? And is it more valuable than you actually putting the computer down and going off down the road and meeting someone and having a coffee with them? Does it give you as much satisfaction? And the answer, of course, is no, of course not. But we're only at this point in our understanding of our digital behavior that I think we can acknowledge that.
Do you think this is a bit of a day of reckoning for social media?
Yeah, I do. And I think it's not zero sum. I'm never going to give up my phone. I love being connected to people that I used to go to school with. I love hearing from people randomly. This is absolutely not zero sum, but it is about, I think, a reckoning to protect the things that are truly precious and mean things to us. And here's the thing, other than your DNA and your genetics, the single thing all the studies show that will guarantee you a longer and a happier life is the quality of who you love and who loves you back. And you have to be an active participant in it. And I think what digital behavior does, and God knows, I'm as guilty as anybody, is that it sucks you into being a voyeur and a spectator of other people's lives, and it stops you being a participant in your own life. And it's hard to be a participant. People get rejected, it requires effort, you're tired, you're not looking good, all that stuff. But actually you get so much more satisfaction out of being part of a team, of doing things with other people, of building things, whether it's, creating a home for Habitat for Humanity, or being in an amateur dramatics show, or being in a sports team. It doesn't matter if you win or lose, it's the process of doing it that's the fun part. And it's also how you connect with other people, and then how you meet people to love.
Very, very true. So now that everyone has the book and they're going to go home and read it, give us the summary piece of best advice that they can find in there. What's the one piece you would leave with anyone who's looking to build a relationship?
Well, I wrote the book as a sort of diet book for love, comparing food and love, because we can't live without them. We have huge appetites for both. When they're good, they're fantastic. And just as there is junk food, that can be really toxic, I think there are junk relationships that you can get sucked into. And so I think of it in terms of, how do you want to spend your emotional calories? Do you want to spend them on this person, or do you want to save them for someone over here? And it's that sense in which, do you constantly want to be stuffing your face with things that aren't necessarily good for you? Or do you actually want nutritious relationships, which, like a healthy, well-mixed diet, will sustain you for the long haul? Partly because we all spend so much time thinking about food and diet, and there's always a new wellness craze coming out. And I do think that it's very interesting that tech has come along at the same time, and I almost hesitate to say this because I'm not a religious person, but I think far fewer people go to church now, go to temple, go to mosque, whatever. And so we have fewer places where we can go and sit with other people and admit that we don't have the answers. We just have a lot of questions, and life can feel out of control and scary and weird and lonely. And we have fewer of those places now. They're not at the center of our communities. And instead we have the gym, we have a yoga class, we have Starbucks, we have third places, we have WeWork, but they don't quite fulfill what I think was fulfilled by people actually sitting together. But as I say, I'm not a religious person. I grew up going to church. I don't go anymore, but I feel the lack of it in my life still. So I think these are interesting points which I raise in the book and then urge people to find new ways. And the one thing I will say, if I'm leaving you with anything, it's like, let go of the ex. Don't be sleeping with the ex when you know it's not going to go anywhere. And I liken it a bit to the donut.
Does anyone feel like she's talking directly to you right now?
Well, I hope you're not.
No.
But we all know that thing of the blood sugar low at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, right? When you haven't had quite enough for lunch and you're hungry, and the donut's sitting there and it looks so nice and tempting, and you eat it and it's comforting and it's sweet and it's familiar, and you're like, oh, I love this donut. And 45 minutes later, you're like,
You regret it deeply.
You're having another sugar crash. You're like, why did I do that? And you're still hungry. So stay away from the donut.
Who masquerades as your ex.
Yeah.
Stay away from the donut is a great quote. Okay, so we're going to open it up for audience Q&A. We're going to start in San Francisco. Rochelle, is that preferable? Okay, great. So questions for Joanna. Looks like we have our first one already.
Oh, good.
Hi.
I love audience questions.
And we've got some that'll come from the stream via Rochelle, too.
Great, okay.
Hello, Joanna. Thank you so much for being here. So my question is, I recently left LinkedIn February 12th, really excited about it, and I've been on this wonderful journey of self-love. And I wanted to know if in your book you address self-love and discovery of oneself at all. Thank you.
Yes, I do. Actually, the book contains, great question, congratulations. The book contains several exercises for people to do. And one of the exercises is to keep a journal. And if anyone has ever been on a diet, you know, one of the best ways of tracking food is to keep a journal. But everybody in this office is I'm sure, constantly being talked about, being talked to about the importance of data analytics. And I suggest in the book that you become your own data analyst and that you start monitoring your own behavior. And the easiest way to do that is to keep a journal. And you don't have to write screeds every night. You can talk into your phone, you can take pictures. But if you monitor your own behavior over 3, 6 months, a year, you will notice patterns, and you will notice the people that trigger you to do things that you don't want to do, the friends you have that make you feel out of control, you end up drinking more with them, or whatever you do. And you'll end up noticing when you're happier and when you're less happy and when you're frustrated, and the people that in that world. And I think it's really, really beneficial. If you're interested in finding out about yourself, it will also help you figure out what you want in someone else. And people often say, oh, I just want this, or I just want this, but they're sort of actually not being truthful because they're scared to admit what they want, because it's hard to admit what you want. None of this stuff is easy. This is the stuff of grappling with your life, and what does your life mean, and are you going to have a big life and a good life, or are you going to have a mediocre life because you daren't step up and grasp the metal? So there's a lot in the book about how to do that, because not everybody can afford $350 to sit with a therapist for an hour, and not everybody needs that either. So great question, and good luck on your journey.
And congrats to you too as well.
Thank you.
Caroline.
Hi, Joanna. How are you? Thanks
Good.
so much for being here. I'm a journalist as well. I'm one of the editors here at LinkedIn. And thank you so much for being an influencer, by the way. You talked a little bit about how fast the media landscape is changing and the role that tech and social media is having a little bit in that. Could you talk a little bit more about what trends you're following that you think, as a young journalist, I should be following as well, and then any advice that you might have for, a young writer who's trying to make it in her career as the landscape is changing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that, above all else, I would really emphasize now, I think that there is a new trend to quality. I mean, you see what's happening with the Washington Post breaking all subscription records, similarly with the New York Times, that people are hungry for real information that feels validated, that's not nonsense. And Evan was right 4 years ago when he said there's a lot of crap out there. Just because it's online doesn't mean it's good. And we've sort of seen the implications of that over the last 2 years. So I would urge you to stick to quality and content and tell stories that aren't being told. I do think it's amazing that we've got this sort of rising of new voices from different communities that were really sort of kept out. And I think it's about a return to quality.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. Big fan of Project Runway. Also.
Good.
Thank
Good.
you.
Thank you.
So a lot of what you were talking about today reminded me of a recent article I read in the New Yorker called Cat Person.
Oh, I loved that person. Fascinating story.
I wanted to know what you thought of it in the context of women, particularly taking agency about, their romantic relationships, how they kind of see themselves, especially in this online-offline interaction. And then, especially when we think about at LinkedIn in that business or work environment, how can we apply, agency that we feel in personal and professional relationships as young women or young men moving forward in our careers?
Yeah, great
Probably
question.
valuable to give a little synopsis
Yes,
of
a cat person.
to
Yeah.
the audience.
For those,
Since we were all scrolling Facebook for our friend's breakfast, we probably didn't read Cat Person.
Well, for those of you who didn't read it, Cat Person was a piece that just completely went viral in the New Yorker. It was a fiction story about a girl who sleeps with a man that she doesn't want to sleep with. And as she sleeps with him, she feels sorry for him and revolted by him. And then he doesn't understand that she's not enjoying it. He thinks he's giving her a good time. And then when he drops her off at her college dorm, he tries to stay in touch with her and she has no interest in staying in touch with her. And all the time that she's doing this, she's narrating in her head to a fantasy boyfriend how this man makes her sort of feel revolted. It's a very, very interesting story, and if you haven't read it, you can read it for free online. I thought that the story completely illuminated what I was trying to say, which was that they have a texting conversation, they build up a relationship, and she is extremely hopeful and builds him up to be something that he turns out not to be. He has spent an enormous amount of time watching porn, so expects her to behave like a porn star, which is another complaint that I heard repeatedly from young women, that we now have a generation of men and women who've grown up with porn as their de facto sex education. And in fact, it's only mandated in 13 states across America that schools actually have to teach kids how babies are actually born. And so the default sex education now is porn. And porn is devised for camera angles. It's not devised for physical enjoyment. And as those of you who've had sex in the room know, and that might not be everybody, and again, no judgments, everybody's to their own, good sex is about good communication, and it's difficult to have with people that you've just met. It's difficult to have when you're drunk. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. And women repeatedly told me that they felt that men expected them to behave like porn stars, which is exactly what happens in the book. She talks about him flipping her over and making all these comments and sort of trying to reenact what he thinks she will find sexy, and of course she doesn't. I thought it was a great story, and it was a sad story, and the fact that so many women related to it I thought was interesting. So I guess bottom line, the expectations she'd created this sense of him and he wasn't that. And also, I think that digital behavior does in some way stop people thinking they can take agency over their own lives. And that's what I mean about watching other people's lives and becoming a voyeur and not being able to participate fully in your own life. And that story sort of writ large.
What was the lesson in Cat Person?
Well, the lesson in Cat Person, I'm not sure there was a lesson really, other than it's kind of fucked and men and women aren't talking to each other very well.
Clearly.
And that she felt, she felt she had no agency. And it was also replicated actually in the Babe.net story with the girl who felt that she couldn't leave Aziz Ansari. Having gone to his apartment,
right, exactly.
She couldn't then get out
Got
of
it.
doing it.
I
So
think
how
Cat
would you
Person
tell
will
women
probably...
to have agency in those types of relationships or those types of interactions?
Well, look, you have to take agency. You have to do it. I mean, there's 2 chapters in particular in the book talking about how you extricate yourself if you get into a situation where you think you are physically threatened, all sorts of ways to try and get out of that situation. And, there's a big chapter on alcohol and telling people don't drink with strangers and do not get blackout drunk. And do not make alcohol your de facto consent, because that way regret lies. And 50% of sexual assaults take place with alcohol, which is not to say that anybody should take advantage of anybody when they're drunk. Of course not. But know the facts going into a situation. Do not get blackout drunk. It is not empowering. And more importantly, you will not have fun. And if the goal here is actually to have fun, you're not going to do that if you get blackout drunk.
I thought your section where you talked about know your tipping point was really valuable for
Yeah,
people.
know your limits,
know if it's 2
respect your
glasses of
limits.
wine, know if it's 2 martinis, but don't go over it, right?
Okay, great. We have a couple questions that came in from the stream. One is, how do I convince my teenage daughter to not spend so much time online with her peers? When all her peers are on their phones?
Yep, great question. I think it's about finding stuff that is really fun to do offline and really encouraging her and creating digital hygiene around devices. Now, I don't know how old her daughter is, but, saying, why don't you, take half an hour off, set a timer, give yourself half an hour free, come and help me in the kitchen, come and make something, go out and play, go and walk the dog, go and see a friend, go to the movies, go to the mall. Again, they're always reflecting that experience back at their friends, but I think it's about being in the physical world, which can feel a little disappointing compared to some of the fun that's going online. I get it. So I think you have to sort of do it slowly and do it by trial and error. But I think the timer that is in the phone is super useful. And I know when I'm trying to do a project and I feel overwhelmed by it, if I can give myself 45 minutes on the timer and sit down and I say to myself, okay, 45 minutes, then I can check my email or I can then check my texts. I get much more done if I do that. And then it gives you give yourself permission to begin to get into something else, which requires more concentration. And we know our concentration spans, when you spend time on your device, get shot. And again, if you can get up early in the morning and get stuff done before you go onto your email or your texting or whatever your preferred mode of communication is, it's somehow your brain fresh in the morning feels more valuable than later in the day.
Good advice for teens and for all of us.
Yeah.
Definitely. I think we have time for one more question.
Okay.
So do that. Someone said they read that you're on the board of Women Entrepreneurs of New York, and they wanted to just know more about that and the work that you're doing with that group.
Well, it's a really interesting group, and it's really aimed at people who don't think of themselves as entrepreneurs, but are entrepreneurs. They've never had any formal business training. They live in the outer boroughs of New York where there's less access to things that might help them. And it might be someone who's babysitting a whole group of kids, and actually she's sort of running a childcare centre. It's just she doesn't see herself as doing that. Or it's someone who's, a really good cook and baking cakes for friends and for their weddings and things. And it's about them saying, well, actually, you could be running a catering business. And if you help yourself to these resources, we can help you expand it and grow it. And so it's really about helping people understand what their skills are and then growing on those. And we have some wonderful successes of bakeries and all sorts of nurseries and things that people have created. And of course, they're businesses around which they can also look after the rest of their lives. So it's a great organization.
Great question. I didn't even know you did that.
Yeah, it's fun. It's really fun.
Great. So on that note, I think we are going to wrap. I do have good news for the San Francisco attendees, which is that Joanna is going to be here for a little bit to sign your book. If you would like to get an autographed copy, this is your chance to do it. I wanted to thank everybody who joined us from the stream. A very engaged audience here. I really appreciate you all being here, and big thank you to you for making us a stop on your Whistle Stop book tour.
Well, thank you very much. It's really fun. Great questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.